Hey there, folks. Thanks for tuning in today. I've got a story that'll hit you right in the gut. One that's equal parts heartbreak, betrayal, and the kind of justice that makes you want to stand up and cheer. It's called The Land They Took. Picture this. A soldier comes home after serving his country, expecting to collapse into the comfort of his own bed, only to find his home erased, stolen by the very people he swore to protect. This is the tale of Jake Sullivan, a man who fought wars abroad only to face a dirtier one on his own soil, and how he turned the tables on those who thought they could bury him. Buckle up, because this one's a wild ride, and it all starts with a homecoming that went so wrong, it'll leave you speechless. The desert dust still clung to my boots as the taxi rolled to a stop at the edge of a cul-de-sac I hadn't seen in 14 months. I was back in Pine Hollow, a quiet suburb outside Raleigh, North Carolina, where the air always smelled faintly of pine and the lawns were so perfect they looked like they'd been ironed. I'd been in Iraq, leading a squad through night patrols, dodging IEDs, and pulling my guys out of ambushes. All I wanted now was to surprise my dad, sink into my old bed, and maybe eat a plate of his famous chili without the threat of mortar fire. I'd been dreaming of this moment since the day I deployed, picturing the little brick house with its green shutters, the oak tree out front where I'd hung a tire swing as a kid, and the porch where Dad and I used to sit, cracking open beers and solving the world's problems one conversation at a time. I paid the driver, slung my duffel over my shoulder, and stepped onto the sidewalk. The street was quiet, too quiet, like it was holding its breath. I took a few steps toward 217, Oak Lane, my address since I was born, and then I froze. Where my house should have been, there was a playground. A shiny, colorful playground with slides, monkey bars, and a couple of kids chasing each other while their moms chatted on benches. A wooden sign read, Pine Hollow Community Play Haven, sponsored by the Pine Hollow Homeowners Association. I blinked, thinking maybe the jet lag was screwing with my head. I checked the street sign again. Oak Lane, clear as day. Then I saw it. The oak tree, still standing, still bearing the initials JS, I'd carved into it at 16, right before I enlisted. This was my land. But my house. Gone. Vanished. Like it had never existed. My chest tightened, and for a second, I was back in Fallujah, heart pounding as a sniper's round whizzed past. But this wasn't combat. This was home, where it was supposed to be. A woman in a bright pink tracksuit glanced at me, her eyes narrowing as her toddler waddled toward my duffel. "Keep your bag away from my kid," she snapped, scooping him up. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My brain was still trying to process the fact that my living room, where I'd watched Sunday football with Dad, was now a sandbox. I walked toward the tree, my boots crunching on the gravel path that cut through what used to be my front yard. The playground was pristine, with fresh mulch and a little water fountain shaped like a frog. A plaque at the entrance quoted some nonsense about community harmony and joyful spaces. I stood there, staring at it, feeling like I'd been punched in the soul. A guy jogged by, earbuds in, and I flagged him down. "Hey, what happened to the house that used to be here?" I asked, my voice rougher than I meant it to be. He pulled out an earbud, shrugged, and said, "Oh, that place. Owner didn't pay taxes or something. HOA took it over, turned it into this. Nice, right?" He jogged off before I could say anything else, oblivious to the fact that I was the owner. Or at least, I was supposed to be. I'd filed for a military tax exemption before I left, standard procedure for deployed service members. There was no way I owed taxes. No way my house should be gone. I dropped my duffel and sat on the curb, the weight of 14 months of war and this new betrayal pressing down on me. I thought about Dad, who'd been living in the house when I deployed. He'd had a heart scare a few years back, and I'd begged him to move to a condo, but he loved that house too much. Said it was where he felt Mom's presence, even 5 years after she passed. I hadn't heard from him in a couple of months. His letters had stopped, and I'd figured he was just busy. But now, staring at this playground, a cold dread settled in my gut. Where was he? Was he okay? And how the hell did this happen? I pulled out my phone and called his number. Straight to voicemail. I tried again. Same thing. My hands shook as I scrolled through my emails, looking for any clue, any notice about taxes or foreclosure. Nothing. Just deployment orders, a few messages from my squad, and spam about car warranties. I stood up, pacing, trying to keep the panic at bay. I wasn't trained to lose control, but this was different. This wasn't an enemy I could see or fight. This was my home, my roots, ripped out from under me while I was halfway across the world, risking my life for people who apparently didn't give a damn. I grabbed my duffel and started walking toward the community center at the end of the street. The Pine Hollow HOA had always been a pain, finding people for leaving trash cans out too long, sending nasty letters about unapproved mailbox colors. But this was theft. This was war. And if they thought they could take everything I'd fought for without a fight, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. I didn't know it yet, but I was stepping into a battle dirtier than anything I'd faced overseas, against an enemy who hid behind bylaws and fake smiles. And I was going to make them regret ever crossing Jake Sullivan. The Pine Hollow Community Center was a squat, beige building with floor-to-ceiling windows and a sign out front boasting Neighborhood Unity since 1998. It looked like the kind of place that hosted book clubs and yoga classes, but as I pushed through the glass doors, it felt more like walking into an enemy command post. The air inside was cool, scented with lavender air freshener, and the receptionist, a middle-aged woman with a tight bun and a name tag reading Marlene, barely looked up from her computer. I dropped my duffel by the door, the thud echoing in the quiet lobby, and cleared my throat. "I need to speak to someone from Disease the HOA," I said, my voice steady but laced with the kind of edge that made my squad snap to attention back in Iraq. Marlene glanced at my uniform, her eyes lingering on the dust-stained boots, and pointed to a hallway. "Boardroom's down there. They're in a meeting, but you can wait." I didn't wait. I marched down the hall, my boots leaving faint trails of desert grit on the polished floor. The boardroom door was half open, and I could hear voices, clipped, self-important, the kind of tones people use when they think they're untouchable. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. 5 people sat around a mahogany table, papers and coffee cups scattered in front of them. At the head was a woman in her late 50s, her blonde hair sprayed into a helmet, her lips painted a shade of red that screamed, "I'm in charge." She was mid-sentence, waving a pen like a scepter when her eyes landed on me. The room went silent, and I felt every pair of eyes sizing me up. My camouflage fatigues, my unshaven jaw, the duffel strap still slung over my shoulder. "Can we help you?" the woman asked, her voice dripping with the kind of politeness that's really just a warning. "I'm Jake Sullivan," I said, stepping forward. "I used to own the house at 217 Oak Lane. Now it's a playground. I want to know why." The woman's smile didn't budge, but her eyes flickered, like she was recalculating something. She introduced herself as Deborah Whitaker, president of the Pine Hollow HOA. The others, 2 men and 2 women, all dressed like they were auditioning for a country club, nodded but stayed quiet. Deborah leaned back in her chair, folding her hands. "Mr. Sullivan, I'm sorry you're upset, but that property was foreclosed due to unpaid taxes. The HOA acquired it legally to enhance the community. It's all in the records." She gestured to a stack of folders, her tone suggesting the matter was closed. I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to flip the table. I filed a military tax exemption before I deployed. Federal law protects service members from losing property while overseas. "So how did this happen?" Deborah's smile tightened, and one of the men, a guy with a comb-over and a tie covered in tiny golf clubs, coughed nervously. "Well," he said, "there must have been a mix-up. Paperwork gets lost. You'd need to check with the county." I stared at him, then back at Deborah. "A mix-up? My house is gone. My dad was living there. Where is he?" The room went quiet again, and I saw it, a flash of unease in Deborah's eyes, gone as quick as it came. She said she didn't know anything about my dad, that the house was empty when they took it. "Empty?" I snapped. "He was there when I left. You expect me to believe he just vanished?" I demanded to see the records. Deborah hesitated, then slid a folder across the table. It was filled with legal jargon, tax liens, foreclosure notices, HOA meeting minutes approving the land transfer. But something was off. The dates didn't line up. The exemption I'd filed was nowhere in the file, and the signature on the foreclosure notice wasn't mine. It looked like someone had tried to mimic my handwriting, but the loops on the J were too flourishy, not my style. I pointed it out, and Deborah's face stayed calm, but her fingers tapped the table, a tell I'd learned to spot in interrogations. "This is forged," I said, my voice low. "You know it, and I know it." She stood, smoothing her blazer. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Sullivan. I suggest you take it up with the county clerk. Now, we have a meeting to finish." I left the boardroom, the folder tucked under my arm, my blood boiling. Outside, I sat on a bench, flipping through the papers again. The more I read, the worse it got. The HOA had voted to seize my land 6 months ago, claiming it was abandoned. They'd sold it to a company called Harmony Holdings, which, according to the fine print, was linked to Deborah's brother-in-law. The playground was just the start. They were planning a whole community enhancement project, including a coffee shop and a yoga studio, all on my land. I felt sick, not just for myself, but for Dad. I tried his number again. Voicemail. I sent a text, then another, my thumbs shaking. Dad, where are you? I'm home. Call me. Nothing. I headed to the county clerk's office, a gray building that smelled like old paper and bureaucracy. The clerk, a guy named Tom with glasses perched on his nose, looked at the folder and frowned. This doesn't add up, he said, tapping his keyboard. Your exemption was filed. It's in the system. Someone manually overrode it. He printed out a record showing my exemption, time-stamped a month before the supposed tax delinquency. You'll need to file a formal complaint, he said, handing me a stack of forms. But I'll warn you, the HOA's got pull around here. They've got lawyers, and they don't play nice. I thanked him and left, the forms feeling heavier than my duffel. That night, I checked into a motel on the edge of town, the kind with flickering neon signs and stains on the carpet. I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing the playground, the oak tree, Dad's face. I thought about the last letter he'd sent, months ago, complaining about the HOA fining him for a cracked mailbox. He'd laughed it off, said he'd handle it. But what if he couldn't? What if they'd pressured him, harassed him, driven him out? My mind spiraled, picturing him alone, sick, or worse. I sat on the bed, staring at the folder, the forged signature burning a hole in my brain. This wasn't a mistake. This was a setup. And I wasn't just fighting for my house anymore. I was fighting for answers, for Dad, for everything they'd tried to erase. The next morning, I woke up with a fire in my chest, the kind that had kept me sharp during night raids in Iraq. I wasn't going to let Deborah Whitaker and her HOA cronies hide behind their polished boardroom and fake smiles. I showered, put on a clean shirt, and headed back to Pine Hollow, the forged documents tucked in my bag. The neighborhood looked even more surreal in daylight. Perfectly trimmed hedges, pastel mailboxes, kids riding bikes in circles. It was the kind of place that screamed American dream, but to me, it felt like a trap, every manicured lawn hiding a lie. I went straight to the community center, determined to confront Deborah again, but the receptionist, Marlene, stopped me. She's not here, she said, barely looking up. Try the clubhouse. She's hosting a brunch. The Pine Hollow Clubhouse was a glass and brick monstrosity, built last year with HOA dues, according to a plaque by the entrance. Inside, it was all chandeliers and white tablecloths, like a wedding venue for people who hated fun. I heard laughter and the clink of glasses before I saw them. A dozen residents, mostly women, gathered around a buffet of mimosas and pastries. Deborah stood at the center, holding court in a floral dress, her laugh sharp enough to cut glass. She spotted me as I walked in, and her smile froze, like a predator caught in headlights. The room quieted, and I felt the weight of curious stares. Mr. Sullivan, she said, her voice syrupy but cold. This is a private event. Members only. I'm not here for brunch, I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. I'm here about my house. The one you stole. A murmur rippled through the crowd. A woman with a pearl necklace gasped, and a guy in a polo shirt muttered something about troublemakers. Deborah's eyes narrowed, but she kept her composure, gesturing to a side room. Let's discuss this privately, she said, like she was doing me a favor. I followed her, not because I trusted her, but because I wanted answers, and I wasn't leaving without them. The side room was a small office, walls lined with framed certificates praising the HOA for community excellence. Deborah closed the door and sat behind a desk, folding her hands like a principal about to scold a kid. You're making a scene, she said. That's not how we handle things in Pine Hollow. I pulled out the forged documents and slapped them on the desk. This is how you handle things. Fake signatures. Overridden exemptions. You took my house while I was deployed, and now you're acting like it's my fault. She glanced at the papers, her face unreadable. I don't know anything about forgeries, she said. The county handled the foreclosure. Maybe you should have been more responsible. That word, responsible, hit like a slap. I'd spent 14 months keeping my squad alive, navigating minefields, and carrying wounded civilians to safety. And here was this woman, who probably spent her days debating mailbox heights, telling me I wasn't responsible. I leaned forward, my voice low. Federal law protects deployed soldiers from losing property. You broke it, and I'm going to prove it. For the first time, I saw a crack in her armor, a twitch in her jaw, a flicker of doubt. But she recovered fast, standing up. You're out of your depth, Mr. Sullivan. The HOA followed protocol. If you have a problem, hire a lawyer. Now, I have guests. I didn't move. Where's my dad? I asked. He was in that house when I left. What did you do to him? Her eyes widened, just for a second, before she shrugged. I told you the house was empty. Maybe he left. People move, you know. She opened the door, a clear signal to get out. I grabbed the documents and walked past her, but not before saying, "This isn't over, Deborah." Not by a long shot. As I left, I heard her call after me. "Don't make trouble, soldier. You won't like the consequences." Outside, I stood by the oak tree, trying to calm the storm in my head. The playground was empty now, the slides casting long shadows in the late morning sun. I thought about Dad, his stubborn love for this place, the way he'd sit on the porch with a book, waving at neighbors. He wasn't the type to just leave without a word. Something was wrong, and Deborah's dodge about the house being empty only made it worse. I needed help, someone who could dig deeper than I could. That's when I remembered Sarah Chun, a buddy from basic training who'd gone into private investigation after her discharge. She was in Durham, not far from here, and she owed me one after I'd covered for her during a drill sergeant's inspection. I called Sarah from the motel that night. She picked up on the second ring, her voice as sharp as ever. "Jake? Holy hell, you're back stateside." I told her everything. The house, the playground, the forged documents, Dad's disappearance. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said, "Sounds like a classic HOA scam. They're like mini-mafias sometimes. Send me those documents. I'll start digging." I emailed her scans of the folder, feeling a spark of hope for the first time since I'd gotten back. Sarah was relentless, the kind of person who could find a needle in a haystack and then use it to pop someone's ego. If anyone could unravel this, it was her. Before I hung up, Sarah asked, "You sure you want to go down this road, Jake? These people don't play fair. You might not like what you find." I thought about the oak tree, the initials I'd carved, the house that held every memory of Mom and Dad. "I don't have a choice," I said. "They took my home. I'm taking it back." She chuckled, a sound that reminded me of better days. "All right, soldier, let's go to war." Waiting for Sarah to dig into the HOA's dirt felt like sitting in a foxhole, knowing the enemy was out there, but not sure when they'd strike. I spent the next few days in a haze, splitting my time between the motel and the county library, where I pored over public records on a clunky computer. The library was quiet, smelling of old books and coffee, and it gave me a place to think. I found a few articles about Pine Hollow's community revitalization projects, all glowing with praise for Deborah Whitaker. She was painted as a suburban saint, turning blighted lots into parks and playgrounds. My house was mentioned once, described as vacant and delinquent, a phrase that made my stomach churn. There was no mention of me, my deployment, or Dad. It was like we'd been erased. I kept trying Dad's phone, leaving voicemails until his inbox was full. I called hospitals, shelters, even the VA, but no one had a record of a John Sullivan matching his description. The not knowing was worse than any firefight. In combat, you had targets, objectives. Here, I was fighting shadows. I started walking the neighborhood at night, hoping to spot something, a clue, a neighbor who might know more. Pine Hollow was eerie after dark, the streetlights casting long shadows, the houses glowing with the soft flicker of TVs. I'd stop by the oak tree, running my fingers over the carved initials, grounding myself in the one thing that still felt real. On the third night, I noticed a figure watching me from across the street. An older man, maybe 70, with a gray beard and a baseball cap pulled low. He was leaning against a mailbox, smoking a cigarette. When I looked his way, he nodded, like we were sharing a secret. I crossed the street, cautious but curious. "You Jake Sullivan?" he asked, his voice rough, like he'd smoked a pack a day for decades. I nodded, and he flicked his cigarette into the grass. "Name's Earl. Used to live 2 streets over. I know what they did to your place." My pulse quickened. What do you know? I asked. Earl glanced around, then lowered his voice. Deborah and her crew have been pulling this crap for years. They target people who can't fight back, old folks, single parents, soldiers like you. They fake the paperwork, scare people into leaving, then flip the land for profit. Your dad, he didn't go quietly. They harassed him, fines, letters, even cut his power once. Last I heard, he was staying at a friend's place in Raleigh, but that was months ago. I gripped the strap of my duffel, my mind racing. Why didn't you say anything? I asked. Earl sighed, his eyes tired. Tried. They ran me out too. Fined me into bankruptcy over stupid stuff. My fence was an inch too high. I'm in an apartment now. But I see you, kid. You're not like me. You've got fight. He gave me a slip of paper with a name. Rita Morales, a former HOA treasurer who'd quit after clashing with Deborah. She knows where the bodies are buried, Earl said. Find her. And watch your back. Deborah's got eyes everywhere. He walked off into the dark, leaving me with more questions than answers. I tucked the paper in my pocket, feeling a mix of hope and dread. Dad was alive, maybe, but the idea of him being driven out, harassed while I was gone, made me want to tear the HOA apart with my bare hands. I tracked down Rita the next day. She worked at a diner in Raleigh, a greasy spoon with checkered floors and a jukebox that played Johnny Cash. She was in her 40s, with dark hair pulled back and a no-nonsense vibe. When I introduced myself, her face softened. Earl told me you'd come, she said, pouring me a coffee. Over the next hour, she laid it out. Deborah had turned the HOA into her personal fiefdom, skimming dues for consulting fees paid to her brother-in-law's company, Harmony Holdings. Rita had caught her fudging the books and confronted her, only to be pushed out with threats of lawsuits. She's got the board in her pocket, Rita said. And she's got a lawyer, Greg Tanner, who makes problems disappear. Your house? That was her big score. They sold the land to Harmony for pennies, then used HOA funds to build that playground. It's all a front. Rita gave me a USB drive with copies of financial records she'd saved before leaving. It's not enough to nail her yet, she warned. But it's a start. You need hard proof. Emails, contracts, something that ties her to the forgery. I thanked her and left, the USB burning a hole in my pocket. Back at the motel, Sarah called with her first findings. She'd traced Harmony Holdings to a shell company owned by Deborah's brother-in-law, and she'd found emails between Deborah and Greg Tanner discussing problem properties. One email mentioned 217 Oak Lane, with Deborah writing, "The soldier's gone. The old man's weak. It's ours." I read it over and over, my jaw clenched so tight it hurt. They hadn't just taken my house. They'd targeted us, planned it, like we were nothing. Sarah said she was digging deeper, but it'd take time. These people are sloppy, but they're connected, she said. We need to be careful. I didn't want to be careful. I wanted to march into Deborah's house and demand answers. But I'd learned in Iraq that rushing in without a plan gets you killed. So I waited, plotting, letting the anger sharpen my focus. I wasn't just a soldier anymore. I was a hunter, and Deborah was my prey. The motel room was starting to feel like a prison, the walls closing in with every sleepless night. I'd spread out Rita's financial records, Sarah's emails, and the county's exemption forms on the bed, turning it into a makeshift war room. The evidence was mounting, but it wasn't enough. Deborah's operation was slick, layered with just enough legal cover to keep her out of jail. I needed something undeniable, something that would crack her empire wide open. And I needed to find Dad. The not knowing was eating me alive, a constant ache that no amount of planning could dull. I kept picturing him, alone, maybe sick, wondering why I hadn't come for him. The guilt was worse than the anger, and that was saying something. I met Sarah at a coffee shop in Durham, a hipster place with exposed brick and baristas who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. She slid into the booth across from me, her laptop already open. "You look like hell," she said, pushing a coffee my way. I hadn't shaved in days, and my eyes were bloodshot from staring at documents. "Feel like it too," I said, managing a half smile. She pulled up a spreadsheet, her fingers flying over the keys. "Harmony Holdings is a gold mine," she said. "They flipped 6 properties in Pine Hollow over the last 5 years, all with shady foreclosures. Your house was the biggest, but there's a pattern. They target vulnerable owners, fake the paperwork, and sell to themselves at a discount. Then they use HOA funds to improve the land, pocketing the difference. She showed me a chain of emails between Deborah and her brother-in-law, Carl, discussing my property. One line stuck out. "The old man's stubborn, but he'll break. They always do." I gripped the coffee cup so hard I thought it'd crack. Sarah put a hand on my arm. "We're close, Jake. I found a server where the HOA stores their internal files. If we can get in, we might find the smoking gun. Maybe even something on your dad." Hacking wasn't exactly legal, but I was past caring about the rules. "Do it," I said. She nodded, but her eyes were serious. "This could get messy. If they catch wind of us, they'll bury the evidence. Or worse." I spent the next few days laying low, but I couldn't stay still. I started talking to neighbors, cautiously, testing the waters. Most were tight-lipped, either loyal to Deborah or scared of her. But a few opened up. There was Mrs. Larson, a widow who'd been fined $500 for planting tulips instead of roses. She whispered that Deborah had threatened to foreclose on her if she didn't pay up. Then there was Mike, a mechanic who'd lived in Pine Hollow for 20 years. He'd seen Dad arguing with an HOA inspector last summer, something about a code violation on the porch. "Your dad was pissed," Mike said, wiping grease off his hands. "Said they were trying to run him out. I told him to fight, but he was tired, you know? Said he didn't have it in him." Every story added fuel to the fire, but it also painted a picture of a neighborhood under siege. Deborah wasn't just stealing land. She was controlling lives, turning neighbors into spies, punishing anyone who stepped out of line. I started to see Pine Hollow for what it was, a prison disguised as paradise. And I was the only one willing to break the bars. I called Earl again, meeting him at a dive bar on the outskirts of town. He brought a friend, Clara, a retired librarian who'd kept copies of old HOA meeting minutes. "Deborah's been rigging votes for years," Clara said, sliding a folder across the table. "She'd changed the bylaws to give herself more power, then bury the evidence. These minutes show she pushed through your foreclosure without a quorum. The pieces were coming together, but I needed more than paper. I needed leverage, something to make Deborah sweat." That's when Sarah called with a breakthrough. She cracked the HOA's server and found a deleted email from Deborah to Greg Tanner, sent the day after my house was bulldozed. It read, "Sullivan's gone. The old man's out. Make sure the records are clean." Attached was a scanned copy of the forged foreclosure notice, complete with my fake signature. It was the smoking gun we needed, but Sarah warned me it wouldn't hold up in court without corroboration. "We need to catch her in the act," she said. "Set a trap." I spent that night sketching out a plan. It was risky, borderline crazy, but I'd pulled off crazier in Iraq. The idea was to bait Deborah into admitting her scheme, record it, and use it to force her hand. But I couldn't do it alone. I called Colonel Marcus Reed, my old CO, who'd always said he owed me for saving his ass during a mortar attack. He was stationed at Fort Bragg, not far from Raleigh, and when I told him what the HOA had done, his voice went cold. "They stole your land while you were deployed? That's not just theft, Jake. That's treason in my book." He promised to pull some strings, maybe get the army involved in a way that'd make Deborah regret ever crossing me. "You want subtle or loud?" he asked. I didn't hesitate. Loud. As I hung up, I felt the first real spark of control since I'd come home. Deborah thought she'd won, but she'd underestimated me. I wasn't just a soldier. I was a survivor. And I was about to bring the fight to her doorstep. The plan was taking shape, but it was like assembling a puzzle with half the pieces missing. Sarah's email was a start, but we needed more, something that would stand up in court and bury Deborah for good. I spent the morning at the county courthouse, filing a formal complaint with the clerk, Tom, who had helped me before. He looked over my evidence, the exemption record, the forged foreclosure notice, Rita's financials, and whistled. "This is heavy, Jake," he said, "but you're up against a machine. The HOA's got friends in high places. You'll need a lawyer who's not afraid to get dirty." He gave me the name of Ellen Harper, a pit bull of an attorney who'd taken on corrupt HOAs before. I called her from the courthouse steps, and she agreed to meet me that afternoon. Ellen's office was a cluttered mess of files and coffee mugs, but her eyes were sharp, like she could see through walls. I laid out everything: my house, Dad's disappearance, the emails, the forgeries. She leaned back, chewing on a pen. "This isn't just fraud," she said. "It's a RICO case waiting to happen. Racketeering, conspiracy, the works. But we need to move fast. If Deborah gets wind of this, she'll shred everything." She agreed to take my case pro bono, saying she had a personal vendetta against HOAs after one tried to foreclose on her mom's house. "Let's nail these bastards," she said, and I felt a surge of hope, like I wasn't fighting alone anymore. Ellen's first move was to file an injunction to freeze all HOA land transactions, including anything tied to Harmony Holdings. It was a long shot, but if approved, it'd stop Deborah from selling off more stolen properties. Meanwhile, Sarah was working her magic, pulling deleted files from the HOA's server. She found a goldmine, a spreadsheet tracking problem residents, with my dad's name at the top. Next to it were notes: fines issued, power cut scheduled, eviction planned. My heart sank as I read it. They hadn't just harassed Dad, they'd orchestrated his removal, step by step, like a military campaign. I wanted to drive to Deborah's house and confront her right then, but Ellen warned me to stay calm. "Emotion loses cases," she said. "Evidence wins them." I wasn't good at staying calm. That night, I went back to Pine Hollow, walking the streets like a ghost. I stopped at the playground, staring at the slides, imagining the house that used to stand there. I could still picture the living room, the worn leather couch where Dad and I watched old westerns, the kitchen where Mom used to burn toast and laugh about it. The memories were so vivid they hurt, like a wound that wouldn't close. I sat under the oak tree, running my fingers over the carved initials, and made a promise to Mom, to Dad, to myself. I'd get it back. All of it. The next day, I got a call from Earl. He'd heard through the grapevine that Deborah was holding an emergency HOA meeting to address concerns about my complaint. "She's scared," he said. "You've got her rattled." I decided to crash the meeting, not to confront her, but to watch, to see who was still loyal. The clubhouse was packed, residents whispering nervously as Deborah stood at a podium, her face a mask of confidence. She spun a story about misunderstandings with my property, blaming the county for clerical errors. Most of the crowd nodded along, but I saw cracks, Mrs. Larson rolling her eyes, Mike crossing his arms. Deborah was losing her grip, and she knew it. I slipped out before she noticed me, but not before overhearing two board members talking in the hall. "If this goes to court, we're screwed," one said. "Carl's company can't cover the paper trail." I texted Sarah the snippet, and she replied instantly, "Keep them talking." I'm close to cracking Carl's email. The pieces were falling into place, but the waiting was torture. I kept thinking about Dad, wondering where he was, if he was safe. I drove to Raleigh, checking the address Earl had given me for Dad's friend, but the house was empty, a for sale sign out front. The neighbor said the friend had moved to Florida months ago, and no one knew where Dad had gone. Back at the motel, Colonel Reed called with news. He'd gotten approval for a civil engineering exercise on disputed land in Pine Hollow, pending a federal review of my case. It wasn't a full military operation like I'd hoped, but it was a start, enough to make Deborah sweat. "We'll roll in with surveyors, maybe a few vehicles," he said. "It'll look official as hell. You want to send a message? This'll do it." I thanked him, feeling the tide starting to turn. Deborah thought she could bury me with paperwork and lies, but I was building an army. Sarah, Ellen, Earl, Reed. The war was just beginning, and I was ready to fight dirty. The morning of the civil engineering exercise dawned gray and humid, the kind of North Carolina day that made your shirt stick to your skin. I stood at the edge of Pine Hollow, watching the first Army vehicles roll in, a couple of Humvees, a survey truck, and a van marked U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Colonel Reed had kept his word, and the sight of those vehicles, their engines growling like a warning, sent a jolt of satisfaction through me. This wasn't just a show, it was a declaration. I'd been pushed around, erased, but now I was pushing back, and I wanted Deborah to feel it. The neighborhood woke up fast. Residents stepped onto their porches, some in bathrobes, others clutching coffee mugs, their faces a mix of confusion and alarm. Kids pressed their noses to windows, watching as soldiers in fatigues hopped out, unloading tripods and survey equipment. A low-flying drone buzzed overhead, mapping the playground and surrounding lots. I stayed in the background, leaning against my rental car, my cap pulled low. I didn't need to be seen yet. Let Deborah sweat. Let her wonder who'd brought the cavalry to her perfect little kingdom. She didn't disappoint. I spotted her storming out of her house, a McMansion with white columns and a lawn so green it looked painted. She was in a silk blouse and heels, her hair still perfect despite the early hour. She made a beeline for the lead surveyor, a no-nonsense captain named Torres, who was setting up a theodolite near the playground. "What is this?" Deborah demanded, her voice carrying across the street. "This is private property." Torres handed her a clipboard with official orders, his face blank. "Ma'am, this is a federal assessment of disputed land. Please step back." Deborah's face went red, and she started waving her phone, threatening to call her lawyer, the mayor, anyone who'd listen. Torres didn't blink. He just pointed to a number on the orders and went back to work. I couldn't help but smile. For the first time since I'd come home, I felt like I had the upper hand. The soldiers moved with precision, marking boundaries, taking soil samples, and cordoning off the playground with yellow tape. A few residents tried to argue, but they backed off when Torres showed them the federal seal on his paperwork. One woman, the same tracksuit mom from my first day, started filming on her phone, muttering about government overreach. I wondered how she'd feel if she knew her precious playground was built on stolen land. Sarah called as the operation unfolded. She'd hacked into Carl's email and found a bombshell, a contract between Harmony Holdings and a developer planning to build condos on my lot after the playground was relocated. Deborah had been playing a long game, using the playground as a temporary cover to flip the land for millions. "There's more," Sarah said. "I found a memo where she mentions your dad. Says he was relocated to a care facility after a health incident. No details, but I'm tracking it down." My heart skipped. A care facility? Dad hated those places, said he'd rather die in his own bed than be locked up. I pressed Sarah for more, but she needed time. "Hang tight," she said. "We're close." I spent the afternoon watching the chaos unfold. Deborah called an emergency HOA meeting, and the clubhouse filled with angry residents demanding answers. I slipped in, standing at the back, unnoticed in the crowd. Deborah was at the podium, her voice shaking as she tried to spin the military presence as a misunderstanding. But the residents weren't buying it. Mrs. Larson stood up, her voice trembling but firm. "You told us that playground was for our kids, but it's on stolen land. What else are you hiding?" The room erupted, and Deborah's composure cracked. She snapped at Mrs. Larson, calling her hysterical, and that was when I knew she was losing control. I left before the meeting ended, driving to the address Sarah had found for the care facility. It was a low, brick building on the edge of Raleigh, surrounded by wilted flower beds. The receptionist confirmed Dad had been there, but was discharged 2 months ago. "He didn't say where he was going," she said. Seemed upset, kept talking about his house. I left, my mind spinning. Dad was out there, somewhere, and I was closer to finding him, but every step forward came with a new gut punch. Back in Pine Hollow, the military exercise was winding down for the day, but the damage was done. The playground was roped off, the HOA's authority questioned. Deborah's car sped past me as I walked back to my rental, her face pale behind the wheel. She knew I was behind this, and I wanted her to. Let her feel the walls closing in, the way I had when I saw that playground. The war wasn't over, but the first shot had been fired, and it had hit its mark. The military exercise stretched into a second day, and Pine Hollow looked like it had been dropped into a war zone. Survey teams swarmed the neighborhood, marking off lots, digging test pits, and setting up temporary barriers around the clubhouse and several homes tied to Harmony Holdings. The drone buzzed constantly, its whine a reminder that every move was being watched. Residents were in full panic mode, some packing cars, others yelling at soldiers who calmly referred them to the federal hotline. Deborah's empire was unraveling, and I could feel the momentum shifting, like a tide turning before a storm. Sarah's latest find hit like a grenade. She'd uncovered a video from a closed HOA meeting, recorded on a board member's phone and accidentally uploaded to a cloud server. In it, Deborah bragged about clearing out my house, laughing as she described Dad as too old to fight back. She even mocked my deployment, saying, "The soldiers probably not coming back anyway. They don't always make it." My hands shook as I watched, the rage so raw it felt like it could burn through me. Sarah forwarded the video to Ellen, who called it a slam dunk for our case. "This is admissible," she said. "We leaked this, and Deborah's done." I wanted to leak it right then, let the world see her for the monster she was, but Ellen urged patience. "We need to time this right," she said. "The injunction's pending, and the feds are sniffing around Harmony Holdings. If we play our cards right, we can take down the whole operation." I agreed, but it wasn't easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Deborah's laugh, saw Dad's face, felt the weight of the house that was gone. I needed to do something, anything, to keep from losing it. I went back to Pine Hollow, blending into the chaos. The media had arrived, local news vans parked outside the gates, reporters interviewing frazzled residents. I stayed out of sight, but I heard Deborah's voice, shrill and defensive, as she gave a statement near the clubhouse. "This is a witch hunt," she cried, blaming disgruntled former residents for the military presence. The reporters weren't buying it. One asked about my house, and Deborah fumbled, her face flushing as she muttered about legal processes. I recorded it on my phone, a small victory in a long war. That afternoon, Ellen got word that the injunction had been granted. All HOA land deals were frozen, and Harmony Holdings was under federal investigation for fraud. The news spread like wildfire, and by evening, residents were holding an impromptu protest outside Deborah's house, waving signs that read "Stop the HOA" and "Justice for Jake." I watched from a distance, stunned. These were the same people who'd ignored Dad's fines, who'd nodded along at HOA meetings. Now they were turning, and it felt like a crack in the dam. Sarah called with another lead on Dad. The care facility had forwarded a letter he'd received there, addressed from a VA clinic in Charlotte. I drove 3 hours that night, the road blurring as I fought exhaustion. The clinic was closed, but a night nurse remembered Dad. He was here for a checkup, she said. Said he was staying with a cousin in Asheville. She didn't have an address, but it was something. I left a note for Dad, begging him to call me, and drove back, my heart lighter but still heavy with worry. When I got to Pine Hollow, the protest had grown. Someone had leaked the video. Sarah swore it wasn't her, and it was everywhere. Local news played it on loop, and social media exploded with hashtags like #PineHollowScandal and #JusticeForSullivan. Deborah's face was plastered across every screen, her laugh echoing in viral clips. Residents who'd once feared her now jeered as she hurried to her car, shielding her face. The board members were abandoning ship, issuing statements claiming they'd been misled. Carl, her brother-in-law, was nowhere to be found, reportedly under IRS scrutiny. I stood by the oak tree as the sun set, watching the chaos. The playground was still roped off, the slides casting long shadows. I felt a hand on my shoulder. Mrs. Larson, her eyes teary. "We didn't know," she said. "We should have fought for your dad." I nodded, too tired to speak. The victory was sweet, but it was hollow without Dad. Deborah's empire was crumbling, but my war wasn't over. I still had to find him, and I wasn't stopping until I did. The fallout from the video was like a bomb going off in Pine Hollow. By the third day of the military exercise, the HOA was effectively dead. The board had dissolved, its members either resigning or hiding from the media. Deborah's house was surrounded by reporters, her once pristine lawn trampled into mud. The federal investigation had expanded, with agents raiding Harmony Holdings offices and seizing computers. Ellen called it a death spiral for Deborah's operation, but she warned me to stay focused. "She's cornered," she said. "Cornered animals fight dirty." I didn't care. I'd faced worse than Deborah Whitaker, and I wasn't backing down. The neighborhood was changing, almost overnight. Residents who'd lived in fear of HOA fines started talking openly, sharing stories of harassment and extortion. Mike, the mechanic, organized a meeting at his garage, inviting anyone who wanted to take back Pine Hollow. I went, expecting a handful of people, but the place was packed. Old folks, young parents, even kids holding signs saying, "No more HOA." Mike stood on a crate, his voice booming. "We let Deborah run this place like a dictator because we were scared. No more. Jake's fight is our fight." The crowd cheered, and I felt a lump in my throat. These weren't just neighbors anymore. They were allies. Mrs. Larson brought me a casserole that night, a small gesture that hit harder than it should have. "Your mom used to make these for potlucks," she said, her voice soft. "I should have checked on your dad more." "I'm sorry." I thanked her, but the mention of Mom brought back the ache. I ate alone in the motel, the casserole tasting like memories of better days. I kept checking my phone, hoping for a call from Dad, but it stayed silent. Sarah was still tracking the Asheville lead, but she'd hit a dead end with the cousin's address. "I'm not giving up," she said. "He's out there, Jake." The community's support grew stronger. A local contractor offered to survey my lot for free, marking the original foundation of the house. Kids from the neighborhood drew chalk outlines where the porch used to be, adding flowers and hearts. It was cheesy, but it meant something. For the first time, I could see the house coming back, not just as a building, but as a home. The VA reached out, offering to fund part of the rebuild as a gesture of solidarity. Strangers sent donations, some with notes saying they'd been screwed over by HOAs too. I didn't want the money, but Ellen convinced me to set up a fund for the rebuild. Let them help, she said. It's not just about you anymore. Deborah made one last desperate move. She held a press conference in her driveway, flanked by Greg Tanner, her lawyer. She looked haggard, her makeup smudged, her voice shaky as she claimed to be a victim of a smear campaign. The reporters tore her apart, asking about the video, the forgeries, my dad. She cracked, shouting, I built this community. You people would be nothing without me. Tanner yanked her back, but the damage was done. The clip went viral, and by nightfall, she'd fled town, her car packed with boxes. I didn't feel sorry for her. She'd made her bed. I finally got a break on Dad. Sarah found a VA caseworker in Asheville who'd spoken to him a week ago. He was living in a small apartment, too proud to ask for help. The caseworker gave me an address, and I drove through the night, my heart pounding. When I knocked on the door, a tired, gray-haired man answered. It was Dad, thinner than I remembered, but alive. He stared at me, then pulled me into a hug, his voice breaking. Jake, I thought you were gone. We sat up all night, talking. He told me how the HOA had driven him out, fining him until he couldn't pay, cutting his power, sending inspectors to harass him. He'd had a minor stroke, ended up in the care facility, and lost track of me. I didn't want to burden you, he said. I held his hand, promising I'd never let him go again. We drove back to Pine Hollow together, Dad staring out the window at the neighborhood he'd once loved. The military was packing up, but the playground was still roped off, a symbol of the fight we'd won. Residents waved as we passed, and Mike ran out to shake Dad's hand. For the first time, I felt like we were home, even without the house. The war wasn't over, but we were winning, one step at a time. The sun rose over Pine Hollow, painting the oak tree in gold. Dad and I stood on the lot where our house used to be, the chalk outlines and survey flags marking the future. The military had left, their tire tracks fading, but they'd done their job. The playground was gone, dismantled by a county crew after the federal investigation confirmed it was built on stolen land. The lot was bare now, just dirt and memories, but it felt alive, like it was waiting for us to start again. Dad leaned on his cane, his eyes bright despite the lines etched into his face. We'll make it better this time, he said. Your mom would have wanted that. Rebuilding started slowly. The contractor, a gruff guy named Pete, donated his cruise time, saying he'd had his own run-ins with HOAs. Neighbors pitched in, bringing tools, food, even old furniture they thought we'd like. Mrs. Larson organized a schedule, making sure someone was always there to help. Mike brought his kids, who ran around hammering nails into scrapwood, laughing like the lot was their playground now. It wasn't just about the house, it was about the community, stitching itself back together after years of fear. The new civic association, formed to replace the HOA, met in Mike's garage, drafting rules that protected residents, not punished them. They asked me to join, but I declined. I wasn't a leader, just a guy trying to get his life back. Ellen called with updates on the legal front. Deborah and Carl were facing charges, fraud, conspiracy, embezzlement. Greg Tanner had flipped, spilling everything 26/03/2024 11 hours 30 minutes and 2 seconds plus 0000, cutting a deal to avoid prison. The feds were untangling Harmony Holdings' web, seizing assets and freezing accounts. Deborah was hiding out, rumored to be in Florida, but her name was poisoned now. The video had done its job, turning her into a national pariah. I didn't care about her anymore. She was a ghost, irrelevant. My focus was on Dad and the house. The VA's funding came through, and with the donations, we had enough to rebuild close to the original plans. Pete's crew laid the foundation, and I drove the first nail into the porch frame, the sound echoing like a heartbeat. Dad watched, a tear in his eye, and handed me a photo of Mom on the old porch, smiling in a sundress. She's here, he said. I nodded, tucking the photo into my pocket. Every nail, every board, was for her, for him, for us. Sarah came by one weekend, bringing beer and her laptop. She'd taken a job with Ellen's firm, using her hacking skills for good. You did it, Jake, she said, clinking her bottle against mine. I shook my head. We did it. She grinned, and we sat under the oak tree, watching the frame of the house rise against the sky. Dad joined us, telling stories about Mom, about the old days. Neighbors stopped by, bringing food, offering help. Mike's kids drew a sign that read, Sullivan Strong, and we hung it on the tree. The house was finished by spring. It wasn't perfect, new wood instead of weathered, new paint instead of chipped, but it was ours. The porch swing went up last, just like Mom's, creaking softly in the breeze. Dad sat there, a beer in hand, waving at passing neighbors. Pine Hollow was different now, freer, messier, real. People planted what they wanted, parked where they liked, lived without looking over their shoulders. It wasn't paradise, but it was home. I stood on the porch one evening, the flag flying high, the oak tree casting a long shadow. Dad called me over, pointing to the stars. "Your mom's up there, proud as hell," he said. I smiled, feeling her, feeling everything we'd fought for. The war was over. We'd won, not with guns or hate, but with truth, with grit, with people who cared. The land they took was ours again, and no one could ever steal it away.